for somebody who was previously virtuous. They're lowering themselves by embracing this thing that makes them weaker. The state that they arrive at as a result of their descent could be the same state that somebody else has arisen at because they're embracing virtues and rising up from a previously more vicious state, and so they pass each other on the way. There is this sense in which we're sort of climbing or descending. To what extent are we taking responsibility for our character? To what extent are we, to use Voltaire's terminology from Candide, are we cultivating our garden to try to create more free will, more responsibility, more determination to act correctly in the world? And that particular piece of the framework, the ladder, if you will, which I guess Milton talks about, the long is the way and hard that leads out of darkness and into the light. It's like contrasting the stairway to heaven with the highway to hell. One of them is expecting a lot less traffic than the other. So there's this. This was a very ancient perspective on human nature, which is that one of the things that distinguishes us from the other animals is that a wolf is a wolf. It'll be an individual wolf. It'll have its own personality and life experiences and character and relationships. But any two wolves anywhere in the world are sort of framed in by such a rich set of instincts that they're recognizably wolfy in their behavior. You don't see wolves get up on their hind legs, pull out a gun and start shooting other wolves. It's just like not anywhere inside the frame of possibilities for wolf behavior. And you don't see a wolf say, what'd be cool is if we killed all the rabbits now and then ate them later. They might grab one or two or three, but they never like make a mission or an ideology out of one of these kind of intellectual recipes for their paths in life. That's something people do. And so what the ancients thought is that, if you were a rabbit, you would not need this framework of virtues and vices to help make sense out of your own character and your own behavior, because you're framed in already. You're complete. But there's something about people that where the frame is so huge because of the way we evolved that we can be better than the other animals, but we can also be far worse than the other animals. And it's really important for the future of the survival of the species and civilization that culture work together to push us one way and not the other, to help lift us up. Because at our worst, we're just intolerable, and it's not a sustainable deal. We're a species that's too variable and needs a direction, and we need a push. We need help to go that direction to not blow everything up. This is what the ancient Greeks thought, and of course they thought this because they were coming out of a dark age. So the Iliad, the great Greek epic, that was taught to every Greek. That was their textbook. It was read to, recited to them in the cradle. And when they were a little boy, they were all taught passages. They all learned to memorize great sections of it. It was their frame of reference. And it's hard for us as moderns to understand it as a frame of reference because it wasn't about glory. It wasn't about what God told you to do, and it wasn't about a great track record from success to success to success like Americans like to do. It was a tragedy. It was about how the golden age tore itself to pieces and destroyed itself through its own stupidity, through human foolishness. And it launched a dark age that lasted for centuries. People lost, literacy fell, lifespan fell, standard of living, everything collapsed. And so the Greeks, when they were putting together their ethos that led into classical Greece, when they were designing the Olympic Games, when they were designing the Olympian religion, their whole premise was, wow, we really screwed up. I can't believe what a mess we made out of such an amazing beginning. We just somehow just horribly screwed everything up. And so what we need to do is rethink everything: music, religion, literature, sports, everything, and say, how can we make all these things push us away from what we did last time to not ever do that again? So that this is almost the core definition of the classical Greeks, is that they were very, very conscious of what screw ups they had previously been, and they didn't want to do that anymore. And you can see that in this whole virtue vice thing. It's all based on this idea that, oh my God, we have to fix this. We can't just do what comes naturally. We can't just do whatever we feel like doing or whatever we think we should do. That's too dangerous. We need a program.
it's funny, you have like these two camps, to oversimplify it, where you have one that's like, we need to go back to our intuition and we need to reconnect with our bodies, because we've like moved beyond that, but because of that, now we're disconnected from nature, from our biology, and all of that. But it almost seems like, to the extreme, for the people who argue that, they just kind of want to like throw the baby out with the bathwater and just, oh, the reason is terrible. No more logos. Look what it's gotten us. It's destroying the planet and all that stuff. And seems like, from what I've read, I've only skimmed through it, but it seemed like what it was trying to do was figure out how to create a dialectic between the two, in a way where we can incorporate both into something bigger.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly on the nose. There's the three core Greek character types that they thought all human beings fell into were based on what you're saying. You get the people who are too driven by what they want and how they feel at the moment. And as a result, they have no plan. They have no vision overall. It's just they live in an eternal present. And there's an enormous amount of selfishness that's possible. I mean, it all depends on your character, whether the things you feel lead you to behave well or lead you to behave badly. There's I wrote a blog about this about 5-10 years ago. He mentions in the opening paragraph eidos, A-I-D-O-S, D-O-S, which is a core Greek term. And another core Greek term is nemesis. And these two Greek terms were one of the ways of evaluating people's emotional reactions to things that ought to move them. But does it? You could sort of size people up by, are they moved the right way by these things? So eidos is the idea that if you see somebody suffering, you should be moved to pity. You ought to feel empathy and want things to change for the better for them. And that's eidos, that urge, that reaction to say, wow, I don't like it that other people are suffering. I want to do something about that to make it better. And people who lack that can't be trusted based on their emotions. People who have it, you're like, okay, yeah, I'd like your emotions to sort of guide your behavior because you're going to respond well when you see suffering. But people who see suffering and go, that's great. That's not me. I'm glad you're suffering and not me. Of whom there are plenty of people who respond that way. For those people, it's just a menace if they respond to the world emotionally. They need another leash to kind of hold them in and keep them from saying, wow, if only I could make more people suffer, then I might feel even better about my position. Nemesis is a related idea. And the idea of nemesis is if you perceive an injustice, if you see one person mistreat another, or if you see a system mistreating people, you ought to hate that. You ought to see that and go, no, that has to be stopped. That has to be fixed. Even without, directly emotionally experiencing the suffering of the recipient, just to witness the injustice itself ought to outrage you and make you want to change things for the better. But for people who are too wrapped up in climbing the social ladder or climbing the economic ladder or the political ladder, they might like injustice because they might be using injustice to climb that ladder. And so people who lack a proper sense of nemesis can't be trusted either. And not only can't they be trusted on an emotional level, they can't be trusted on an intellectual level. They're going to warp their perceptions of reality to make it seem justified that other people, are treated unjustly because they themselves benefit, and they like that. So these are two of the core concepts the Greek used to use. It's brought up all the time in the Iliad and the Odyssey. These terms appear repeatedly, and the translators often don't understand what core terms these are, and they might use different words for them at different times. But for the Greeks, it should have been the same word every time eidos appeared, and it should have been the same word every time nemesis appeared. If you translate it so that people get, we're talking about measuring people's response emotionally or intellectually to the world, and whether or not they have the uplifting reaction that drives them to the kinds of actions to make the world a better place.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
No, not you, the guys on the call. So if this is something that we've known since, I don't even know what years, this is like ancient times, right?
We're talking about, you mean Eidos and Nemesis?
Yeah,
The
like
ancient
this
Greeks.
period of, yeah, what, this isn't the Pythagoras period of ancient Greeks though, right? This is like, is it the same period?
It starts even earlier, but it goes later. So
Earlier.
Alexander the Great,
Anyway,
who's,
the time doesn't really matter to my question before I forget it, because I will forget it from you.
yeah,
The
go ahead.
question is, if they got it right, like this seems like correct thinking logically, why are we still in this situation 1,000 years later?
So interesting thing, you know, there are a number of critics of modernism who've put together a framework for understanding the last several thousand years of human history, or at least European history. I'd really like to see it broadened to include African and American, Australian and Asian, but right now it's pretty Eurocentric. But it gives us a framework for understanding kind of how did we get from there to here. And it's
right, like why didn't we evolve correctly?
yeah, why did we lose these ideas? How did we get into a situation where somehow the worst of us seem to rise to the top? And they did it with the idea that there are three core ideas. We've talked about this in previous calls, but I'm going to go through it again because it's so central to Kenneth Smith's work. So one,
even just at least a little wee bit of review for me. Thank you.
yeah, no problem. So one is about three core ideas: nature, God, and man, for organizing the whole cosmos. And man here means humanity. That's the old Anglo-Saxon term manan, which has no gender. So the idea is human beings are trying to figure out where they fit into the world and what they ought to do. And to do that, they need context that gives meaning to actions, to choices, to our feelings, to our thoughts. And there's really these three core ideas that we use to orient ourselves. So using the priority among them, which one trumps which one overrides, you can define three great epochs in European history. So in the ancient epoch, it was nature, then God, then man. And what I mean specifically is, to the ancients, the deities were not before nature or bigger than nature. They didn't create nature, right? That's a completely alien idea to the Greeks. What we take for granted as, for example, the medieval worldview, that there was nothing except God, and then God just summoned nature into existence, the ancients would never have believed that. That was completely a foreign idea, because to them, the deities were not rulers who told you what to do and told nature what to do. The deities were, if you looked at nature and you looked at what are the things that have authority over human beings, that are bigger than we are, that are more powerful than we are, that we have to pay attention to, or else we're going to screw up our lives, the ancients called those gods. So the ocean, right, to a seafaring people, the ocean was a god. It could totally take you out at any time. But if you also learned how it worked, and you learned how to sail, and you learned to estimate the weather, then you could successfully take your boats out on the ocean and trade across the world and make all kinds of money. So paying attention to the ocean and how it worked and what it wanted was central to being able to organize your life if you had a seafaring kind of life. Likewise, all the other things that the Greeks set aside as deities, like war, right? Whatever your plans are, if a war comes through, you better pay attention, because it could just knock all your plans awry. You have to be aware of wars that are going on, and how war develops, and how to make peace, how to bring wars to an end. And if you don't, you're not going to be able to live a good life. And the third example I always use on this is Aphrodite, right? Love, attraction. Because whatever your plans might be in life, they could be completely overthrown if you just fall head over heels in love, right? Whether we see it in stories or whether we've experienced it in our own life, we get the idea that even the most controlled person, even the greatest warrior, even the greatest seafarer, even a hermit can be overthrown in their plans by attraction. And that's why Aphrodite is up there among the 12 Olympians, as these are the things that had authority over us. And for the Greeks, there were more than 12. There were only 12 on the council. They wanted a huge cosmos of deities, because they wanted to map out what are all the big things we have to understand in life, to know what to navigate, to know what to pay attention to. So in this model, the gods don't precede nature. They are highlighting the parts of nature we need to be paying the most attention to because it has authority over us. And therefore, humanity is at the bottom of this set of priorities. What people want is tertiary. First, you have to pay attention to how the world works, how nature works. And then you have to pay attention to how the divinities work. And once you know those two things, then you could start to make human level decisions about how you ought to run your life and what ought to be important to you and so forth. So,
Oh, wow. Okay.
so that's a
Um,
framework. And they used it to define two more epochs. In the medieval epoch, which I'm going to jot down here real quick, it was a revolution against the ancient world. And it was based on the idea that you don't need to know about human nature or nature outside ourselves. And there aren't a whole bunch of deities. There's only one deity, and he's the ruler over everything. And nature doesn't matter. Nature's his plaything, right? No meaning comes from nature. There's no point in studying it. All you should be studying is scripture. God's commandments are the only thing that matters. You should do what God says. God will tell you what's important. You should not be deciding for yourself in this framework. You should obey. And nature, likewise, having been evacuated of meaning, having been turned into a mere creation, it's no longer a source of meaning either. So what we have now is a very almost, I might say, Roman model. The Romans thought Rome mattered and no other city mattered. Other cities only matter to the extent that they led you to Rome, and Rome was the center of everything. You needed a single point of organization.
A better set of rules than the first set.
Yes.
But they're not really a better set of rules than the first set. They're just a different set of rules.
Yeah. So that was the medieval revolution, right? The medieval revolution is you don't need all these deities and you don't need all these rulers who tell you that they're better than you are for the following reasons, because you don't need reasons. All you need is faith. All you need is know what the rules are, follow the rules. They have to be God's rules. If somebody wants to be a ruler on earth, he doesn't need natural virtues. He just needs divine blessing, because all meaning comes from God. So divine right became important in the medieval world in a way that it wasn't and couldn't be in the ancient world. In the ancient world, what mattered was your natural character and how you worked to develop yourself to be a better person. But in the medieval world, all that mattered was God's blessing or withholding of the blessing. So that led, for 1,000 some odd years, that organized Europe. And you can see all the big struggles between human institutions in terms of this framework of meaning. Where do you draw your meaning from and what matters and what doesn't? And it's part of why there was a huge collapse in people's understanding of anatomy and physiology, in our understanding of, the different species and how they relate to each other. The Greeks had the idea of evolution, and we lost that because the medieval people thought there's really no point in studying nature. It's just, something God made, and you should just study God. God will tell you what's important. So they looked away from it and they forgot it. So the modern era is based on another revolution. And it goes like this: man, nature, God. It's based on the idea that human beings can decide for themselves what's important, and that there is no God. Or if there is, it's a personal choice. You choose whatever God pleases you. And so it became, this is where the Catholic Church schisms into a whole bunch of different flavors of Christianity, and people are picking the one that they want, which they think they can do because they're moderns. Right? A medieval person would never think I can choose which version of God. They're like, there's only one, and I should be following him. Right? It's a very different attitude towards divinity, and as a result, it's a very different attitude towards authority and meaning. Where do they come from? Well, they come from me. I decide for myself what I want. I negotiate with other people to put together governments or markets or science or what have you, and we sort of somehow decide amongst ourselves that this is what's important. But meanwhile, God has been evacuated of meaning because it's become a consumer choice. Which church do you want to go to? And nature remains evacuated of meaning. We study it, but only to exploit it, to satisfy our desires and our plans and our goals. So what's happened is, to go from the ancient world to the medieval world to the modern world has been a complete collapse of meaning. There's now no source of meaning external to human beings. And as a result, an enormous number of moderns slip into the logical corollary, which is that there's no meaning at all. And nothing matters. And you just decide for yourself what you want and, fight it out. You can have great big world wars to try to get what you want. You can, put together coalitions and political parties to try to outvote your opponents to get what you want. You can, all of the strategies we do for economics, politics, society, religion, all of this stuff has now actually devolved into mere ego and strategies for who's clever and who can impose their will on everybody else. And that's considered legit. If you were that sort of person in the medieval era, you had to dress it up to make it seem like God wanted you to do those things. If you skipped that stage, you could never be king. You had to frame it in a medieval perspective for it to be accepted, even if you were a nihilist. And it's the same in the ancient world. If you were a nihilist in the ancient world and you wanted people to accept you as a ruler, you had to express it in terms of natural virtue, your arete, look at the things that I've done. These things mean that I deserve to be in charge. And, you had to persuade people to go along with that because that was the ancient way of establishing meaning. So the answer to your question is, of what happened, why did we lose this stuff, is that each of these.
And what's next?
Well, yeah, I mean that's the obvious question that this all suggests is, so where is this going, right?
Yeah.
So in each case, what happened is that the people who felt most left out by the previous regime came up with a revolution in their conception of the world that changed meaning and allowed them to say the current order is meaningless and we're going to overthrow it in favor of this new meaning, right? So the Christians knew that that's what they were doing, and they said that's what they were doing. You can read it in Paul and in the Gospels that man's values don't matter to God, right? That was a direct affront against the Romans and the Greeks of the time, and saying, I know all of your explanations, but I don't care about those. I really only care about what God wants. And the same happened with the modernist revolution. It said, well, we don't trust you to tell us what God wants. We don't trust these scriptures. We don't trust these authorities. We're going to decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. We're going to negotiate for ourselves, and we're going to overthrow God as the pinnacle. The pinnacle will now be governments or corporations or some other human thing that was made, that we designed. So because these revolutions had these specific goals, it meant that they had a tendency to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Their focus was not on the value system of the old order. It was on the value system they were trying to replace it with. So there's no way that a Christian revolution in the early medieval period would be focused on, well, I wonder if eidos and nemesis are important. I wonder if cultivating character with virtues and vices and trying to lift people up is important. Their whole focus would change to, you don't need any of that stuff. You don't need any of this stuff. All you need is God. Just like moderns did the same thing. You don't need all these churches and commandments. All you need is to get together in groups and make decisions about what you want to do. And so in both cases, they not only threw out what was in their way and what was bad, but they also threw out what was good in order to establish the new coherent system that made sense in its own right. Does that make sense so far? So
no, none of it makes any fucking sense. It's all practical and it's all a waste.
Yeah, I don't mean is it right?
It makes sense, Rick. It makes sense. I'm sorry. I'm just gonna go along with the flow.
Yeah, I don't mean is it right or wrong. That's a whole other question. But I mean, as far as how we got here,
it makes sense. It's like, yeah, the timeline. Yeah.
Because I mean, who was most screwed in the ancient order was the slaves. Right? The slaves, the people who didn't have any political rights, were the ones who were the angriest and the most frustrated. And so slavery developed Christianity as an idea that says we're all slaves to God and we should all be humble. And those people who have been lifting themselves up above us, they should be pulled down and we can all be equal under God. That was the Christian Revolution. That was how they justified overthrowing the old order. And so it was a revolt of the slaves. And in the medieval era, it was traders, right? It was markets and trade that were being stifled by the kings and the courts and the churches who were trying to maintain their own power, and they taxed the heck out of all financial transactions, and the traders hated it. The merchants just hated being under the thumb of kings and popes and bishops. So they did a revolution that said, all of your stuff doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is we're gonna drop this down to a mathematical, rational basis. We're gonna let the money tell us what to do. We're gonna let the facts tell us what to do. We're gonna let the votes tell us what to do, and we don't need any of that other stuff. So, but it puts us in a difficult position as moderns, because all of this context and framework for evaluating human character and figuring out what we ought to do in life, it's all been thrown out. It's all gone. And people, find it unsatisfying to live that way. We don't like being adrift and contextless. We don't like it when, we can't get together and have a coherent discussion because some people are saying, well, I don't care about anything that you say. I only care about how rich you are. If you're not rich, I don't care about you. Or in a political context, well, how many votes do you have? How many electors, are behind you? If you don't have anybody behind you, I'm just going to ignore you. I'm going to go with, who actually gets me elected. So every one of these systems that we do in the modern era is evacuated of meaning and boils down to some kind of numbers game. And if you don't have the numbers, then you don't matter. And the problem for us as human beings is we revolt against that. We feel like, well, that's not true. People do matter. People should matter. And these systems ought to be paying attention to what we need, not just personally, but I have a sense of eidos. I care about what you need too. If you're suffering, I want that to change. I want the systems to change. And if the systems, the way that they're structured, are inflicting injustice, then I feel outrage, and I want that to change. So these old Greek ideas are still present. They got this right about us, that we have, when we're healthy, we have these drives to try to want to make things better, to identify what's wrong and do something about it. And there's no place for that in the modern world. The modern order doesn't allow for that.
Right. Like people need something new to believe so that they can keep lying to themselves that there's something to believe.
What's
because if there's something to believe,
Hang on.
Hello?
You digitized a little bit there.
Yeah, connection drop.
Hello?
Hey, Chris.
Oh, hey there. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Hey, Chris.
Oh, hey there. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt. Hey there. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Mute your or lower your audio or something.
Yeah, if you just lower the audio a little bit on the speaker, then it won't get the feedback loop. So our challenge as human beings is that we evolved into an incomplete animal. We're all animals, certainly all advanced animals. I shouldn't say advanced, it's not the way we think about things. All psychologically complicated animals need a framework for making decisions, because we can't have all these capabilities and not know when to use them and when not to use them. And so if we were wolves or gorillas or giraffes, we would have a richer suite of instincts to tell us what we ought to be doing. But our big evolutionary leap forward was also a leap backward. We like to present ourselves as above or below or at the same as the animals, but we're not any of those things. We're to the side of them. With this evolutionary leap that allowed us to be smarter and more creative at the cost of being more lost and bewildered. We're missing a whole bunch of instincts. We evolved through neoteny, where juvenile traits, even embryonic traits, are rechained into adulthood. So we look more like baby apes than like adult apes. Baby apes have less hair. Baby apes have bigger heads and bigger eyes, and they watch each other more, and they imitate each other more, and they're more curious. They're more open to new ideas. That was how we evolved to be smarter. But the problem is, when you evolutionarily evolve through neoteny, some of those instincts that should kick in later never kick in at all. We never grow a full coat of hair over our bodies. And in the same way, a whole bunch of the instincts that would have given us a framework for life, they're gone, they're evolved away. And so we end up with this hole inside of ourselves and this ache to fill it, to make sense out of where are we going. It's not about deluding yourself by believing something that isn't true. It's that we truly need to finish the picture. we're born incomplete, and we never become complete biologically. So we need a prosthesis, a psychological prosthesis to make us coherent as animals. And that prosthesis is culture. This is why human beings are the cultured animal. You know, all animals have culture, but their cultures usually are the same or very similar all over the world for each species. But for human beings, it's a big empty frame. Our instincts don't give us enough to have a culture to tell us what things mean and where we should go. And so as a result, what we do have is this ache inside ourselves. I mean, everybody feels it, the ache to understand and to have context and to feel like we belong. And a healthy culture, that's what it fills in. It orients us to the world, and it helps us to make decisions, and it helps us to treat each other and nature around us in ways that are sustainable, that can continue. But the problem is that ache can be used for profit. That ache can be used to turn us into consumers and voters and fans, where we have to keep working and earning money and then doling out the money, not to ever fill the void permanently, but to fill it for a few hours or a few days with a faux solution, a fake, artificial solution that then ebbs away and leaves us aching again, because we don't actually have a culture that satisfies these needs. And the reason it doesn't satisfy them is it's just more profitable not to. It's more profitable to keep us aching and hungry and lost, and then keep offering us, look, a new movie, a new TV show. Look at this great gizmo I can sell you. There's like this constant stream of kind of patchwork treatments for our ache. And that's what modernism does, that's different from the ancient or medieval epoch. That's what it's converged on. By getting rid of all meaning and leaving us in this kind of unoriented state where we're aching all the time, it's created the potential for massive profits and control by just kind of doling out in little bits these things that really we ought to have in a more permanent way.
Almost like sells us substitutes for meaning in the form of distraction.
Yes.
From the very whole that we have.
Yes.
Just like, look over there. And then you won't have to think about the big gaping hole.
That's right.
And that's what consumerism is, and certain egoic kind of gratifications that people get when they can signal high status, and all those things are just kind of just diversions from that big whole thing. It's like God has kind of been turned inside out in a way. And so like the God is now the ego.
Mm-hmm.
Would that?
Yeah, because that's the problem, is you can't put man at the top as a source of meaning, because we have a big aching void where nature has meaning, and the divinities by definition have meaning because that's how they were defined and created. But we, by definition, what we have is this ache for meaning instead of an actual answer. We're just full of questions instead of answers, which is necessary but not sufficient to make us whole psychologically. So we're all sort of kept in this sort of state of kind of hunger and also of psychological incompleteness. That makes it hard for us to understand that people from the medieval epoch or from the ancient epoch, or presumably if there were others before that, or if we look outside Europe, how did people live in Africa and the Americas and Australia and Asia? They too would have had their own epochs based on how they organized their sources of meaning. And all of these other epochs, these people, we were inclined to read their works and study their history as though they were just primitive versions of ourselves. But they're not. They're different in kind because they answered these questions differently than we did. And they were not kept perpetually starving, kind of ravenous for little meaning substitutes the way that we are. And so an example of that, of one of the things that we have trouble reading correctly, is in the Iliad, there's a quote about Achilles. You remember the hero Achilles has the heel that's mortal, but the rest of him is immortal. He's the son of a deity who was dipped in the river or the fire to make him immortal. And he's been living his life, studying excellence and how to be a great warrior, but otherwise sort of in obscurity. He's got his people he trains, and he's off to the side, and he's not central to things. And he's offered the choice. And the choice is, do you want to live a long life in that relative obscurity that you've already lived in? Or do you want to come fight in the Trojan War and achieve immortal fame? And we read that the way that a modern would read it. We think he just wants to be famous because we don't understand the words that the Greeks are using. We don't understand the concepts that those words meaning, because the Greeks didn't have the ache the way that we did. To them, fame was something completely different than it is to us. What the Greeks thought is that this problem of the enormous frame, where people could be really, really good, but they could also be really, really bad, and the need that we had as a culture to put everything together to push people to the good side and try not to let people get to the bad side because it was too awful. They called that paideia. Paideia was their big cultural project to try to educate people. That's what they called anthropoculture. They wanted to raise a crop of human beings who were better than the people who caused the Dark Age. They were trying to cultivate human beings. It was a deliberate thing that they were trying to do. And core to that idea is the idea that for human beings to be psychologically complete, we need to be pursuing these virtues that lift us up. And they tried to catalog the virtues and say, what are they? What are the things we should, like honesty? We should be striving for honesty. Or excellence. We should be striving to do better tomorrow than we did today. They had a list of these things. And their belief was that the key to paideia, because human beings can't understand abstract concepts very well, was to turn everything into stories and characters. That was why they did the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's why they did the Greek myths. Everything, they're trying to take these complex philosophical ideas and boil them down into stories that you could even teach a child. And the child could remember it and be inspired by it and try to lift themselves up. And then when they got older and they could understand better concepts, you could introduce them to more concepts. But, you start with this emotional story-based format. They called that mythos culture driven by myths and stories and characters. So they thought that the best thing a human being could possibly do in their whole life, the pinnacle of human achievement, would be to devote your life to a virtue and live out that virtue so successfully that thereafter, if people wanted to teach that virtue, they wouldn't have to struggle through all kinds of different stories and say, well, this guy was almost brave except for these things. It was like, no, I want to actually live a life of such courage that if people are trying to teach courage, they'll tell my story so that it's easier to raise a new generation of courageous people. That is this concept of a virtuoso. And a virtuoso is somebody who's devoted his life to a virtue so completely that he now has become a lesson in the storybook so that the next generation has an easier time following after us. They thought that's the best thing you could do, right? Devote your entire life to the project of raising the next generation by doing this. So what Achilles is choosing by immortal fame, which we think means, oh, he just wanted people to admire him because we're moderns and that's what we would do. The Greeks were like, no, they didn't have that ache. What they wanted to do was cultivate a better generation of human beings. And Achilles wanted to show what courage and the pursuit of excellence really mean. And he was willing to die decades sooner in order to do that. So even if I know I'm going to die in the Trojan War, if I get the chance to really embody those stories so that the people who come after me can follow my example better than I did, because I had to struggle without an example like that, then it's totally worth giving up 40 years of my life or 50 or 60 years of my life. It's totally worth it. It's a trade I'd do in a heartbeat. That's what he's saying. But we can't read it that way because we're not ancients. We don't think that way. Our entire framework of meaning is different. What is culture? What is a human life? What's meaningful? What's good? What's bad? Why do we do things in the world? How's everything organized? Their framework was different from our framework. Even though we're biologically the same, we were culturally from completely different epochs. So this is our problem as moderns, is we think that we understand the world objectively. We think we're the first people in all of history to see the world scientifically and objectively. But the truth is, we are just like any other epoch in the sense that we have a very specific way of looking at the world that is not real. What it is it's a value judgment. And the value judgment is nature doesn't mean anything. The gods don't mean anything. People don't mean anything. We just measure things and decide what we want to do, and whoever can put together the biggest numbers wins. So we think we're objective, but we're subjective, just like everybody else. But in our own way that makes us that makes us moderns. So this is what he's trying to talk about in this essay. He's using the example of the Greeks and how they saw things to try to help for us draw. What Kenneth Smith's trying to do is help draw apart the idea that they saw the world differently, and that we could learn to see the world the way that they saw the world, not as a replacement for modernism, but as an adjunct. One of Kenneth Smith's core ideas is that the worst thing that can happen to a human being is to be stuck inside a single perspective and to think that that's the only way the world could be understood. And if we do that, it makes us parochial. It makes us xenophobic. It makes us, hostile to other religions, hostile to other cultures, hostile to other languages. We become blinkered and narrow the more that we think we're right and everybody else is wrong. And so if we want to become philosophical human beings, what we have to do is we have to study really crisp examples of completely different ways of looking at the world until we get them, until we can role play them. We would want to be able to so understand that perspective of Achilles that we could role play a conversation between Achilles and Donald Trump arguing about a football game, and imagine what each of them would say. Just like we do with Star Trek, we can imagine what Spock would say and what Bones would say and what Kirk would say, and we can role play those characters, and it helps us to understand those perspectives. What Kenneth Smith is saying is if we can do that with these epochs and find characters that embody an epoch different from ours and get to know them so well that we can mentally put them in an argument with ourselves, then for the first time, we'll be able to understand our own perspective as merely a perspective, one of many. We'll be able to see its advantages, but we'll also be able to see its disadvantages.
It's almost like each epoch being almost like a separate Greek god in a way, or a part of the psyche of history.
Yeah.
But so instead of like compartmentalizing, like Zeus and Apollo and everything, it's compartmentalizing certain eras in history, certain cultures, and trying to figure out how we can create a canon of these gods, of these eras within our mind, and maybe reformat our own perception so that we can have more of an integrated approach to things.
I think that's right. Kate was talking about where do we go from here, and I think part of where we go from here is we want to escape the parochialism of the modern era, where it thinks it's the only real perspective and it thinks it's objective. It doesn't understand it is a perspective. It's like that's the definition of modernism, is to think that we can see it all exactly the way it is when in fact we can't. In fact, we really don't understand other epochs at all, but we think we get them. So if we could do what you're saying, and we could start to hold each epoch up as a character that we could understand and role play and understand what it would do, what it would want, how we would behave, then we could sort of create for ourselves a little pantheon of choices that would open up our own ability to have free will and to have multiple perspectives and to choose differently. I think you're right on the money. And I didn't think that before today. This is the new idea you've given me, but it really fits.
It just popped up in my head. I was putting things together while you were talking. It was just like, oh yeah, that kind of is what the Greeks were doing, but we're doing it in a different way, or we could do it in a different way, and hopefully be maybe more well balanced as a result. I remember reading a book a while back. It was called Preface to Plato. Have you read that at all? I don't know the name of the author.
Let me look it up.
But it went through like the oral tradition and then the literary tradition. And so from like Homer to Hesiod, and then to Plato, and then how like the very medium that was used in order to express ideas like cultural history and everything, to pass on values, completely, just transitioned into the literal, and it created almost like a mutation in consciousness.
Yes.
And so I think he was writing about how like the golden era was like between, like the Homer and Plato, where you had a nice balance between the left and the right hemispheres, so that it was in the dramatic performance of Homer, where you felt like you were a part of the drama, you were swept up by it, and so it was more embodied, and there was like a rhythm to it as well, because it was like poetry. And also people memorized it because couldn't really write it down. Barely anybody was literate at the time.
Right.
And so it was performed. And I think the drama of that probably created a more intimate connection and relationship with the content. And even though the content wasn't literal, it wasn't meant to be literal, it was more of a mnemonic device, because kind of like we can remember lyrics to songs more than we can remember like an academic lecture.
Yes.
Because and it gets stuck in our heads.
Yes.
And I think when you perform something and it has a rhythm to it, almost like a musicality to it, that then it can be used as a mnemonic to remember it, especially if we can't write it down and document it and reread it again and again. So at that time, it almost seemed like that particular medium was needed. It was necessary in order to pass on the traditions and the values of that culture, to pass on the software to the next generation.
Yes. Yeah, that's right on the money. That idea of mythos being a more powerful emotive way to organize meaning and philosophy is something that we've lost as moderns. We think it's all supposed to be, philosophy should be very dry and intellectual and logical. We've become the far end of logos culture, and we
we pick it apart too much now, and it loses its meaning. But
yes.
It has like a meta meaning in a way, but that's not enough.
Yes, that's right. And you look at the way that, how many philosophical ideas from 20th century philosophers does the average American know? But then ask them to do quotes from Star Wars or Star Trek, right? Because the character and the story makes the dialogue immortal for them, right? They feel a relationship to the person. Yeah. The Navajo did that. They had a character in their origin stories named Changing Woman, who was embodied as the first Navajo who got all the basic ingredients right. They said there had been worlds before this world. They had made previous attempts to do Navajo culture. They've gotten basic things wrong and had to leave those worlds, because of the crises that they provoked. And that Changing Woman was the first one who basically got it right. And so the story of Changing Woman's life and her choices is the story of the Navajo value system and how you're supposed to choose things in the world. And as a result, all of the ceremonials that the Navajo do with the sand paintings and the herbs you take, and they last many days, and they've got a medicine man who runs you through all of that. They're all based on these excerpts from her life, the lives of her relatives, because we can remember a person and we can remember a story, and we can then connect. Oh yeah, just like what happened in this episode. There's a episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. It's one of my favorites. It's called Darmok.
Yeah.
You remember Darmok? Anybody remember Darmok?
No,
Right,
I've seen the first couple
it.
seasons, but I haven't gone beyond that.
I'll put it in here.
Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. Yeah.
Yes, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra.
Was his face black, his eyes red, the river run cold, or something like that? Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome.
The basic premise is that there is this race that the Federation is encountering where having a universal translator doesn't help, because it's so much of it is about names of people and places, and there's only just a minimal of connective tissue. Like Darmok and Jalad in Tanagra is one of the first things these aliens try to say to the Enterprise, and it's like, well, we don't know who Darmok is or Jalad or where Tanagra is. What are we even talking about? So Picard goes there and tries to solve the puzzle and figure out how to communicate with these people. And what they eventually learn is that this people believes you can only understand each other by going through shared experiences and learning the stories of those experiences. You take the stories away with you, and afterwards you now have a frame for meaning that you could never get from an abstract treaty or from claiming that you stand for truth or goodness. So Darmok is one of their culture heroes, and Darmok and his friend Jalad have an encounter at Tanagra, and it's a story, and he's trying to teach it to them. And by the end of the episode, they get it. They finally clue in. It's like, oh, we don't know your stories and characters, but now we do. So now we can communicate. And that's sort of, in a nutshell, the human condition. We, in the modernism world, we keep trying to make these systems of laws, but they're so complicated and abstract that no Americans have read them all. Not even a legal specialist has read them all. In fact, legal specialists haven't even read all the laws in just their own specialty. It's so big. It's become a labyrinth outside of their control that captures them. And as a result, since we're governed by these laws, we don't really understand what we're governed by. So we're in a labyrinth. None of it is organized in any way that makes a story for us or makes characters for us.
David.
Go ahead, Ginny.
There's somebody who's trying to come into the meeting. If they don't have the Zoom link, okay? Rick, it's just wonderful listening to you. Just keep on going.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ginny. So this idea that maybe we've gone too far in the logos direction, we're out of balance, and we really should restore a balance with mythos and say it's fine to know logically, mathematically, scientifically, in words, what it is that you're trying to do, but it isn't real for people until you also put it together into a story and characters that illustrate the values, just like Achilles wanted to become part of the story.
Yeah. It reminds me of like this book here by Gene Gebser, The Ever-Present Origin. You ever heard of it?
No, tell me.
Oh, it's an incredible book. It's pretty thick. It's very dense, but definitely well worth it. He goes into different structures of consciousness, the magical, the mythical, the rational, and then the integral. And
Yes.
so he kind of looks at it as like, so the rational contains the mythical and the magic in it, kind of like a Russian doll kind of thing. And so it kind of contains all of it in there, but oftentimes the rational like framework tends to denounce or block out or try to erase everything that came before it. And it creates like a imbalanced, like cognitive structure.
Yes.
So that's when that creates neuroticism, because neuroticism is like a war against the self.
Yes.
You're trying to battle something that is a part of you, an intrinsic part of you that is kind of, it almost seems like it's underneath us, and therefore we're over that. We're over the mythic, but it still is a way that, just like talking about Star Trek, tends to resonate with people more, even though they're rational people, but there's still something within us that is just more appealing or more palatable when you can try to weave together some nuggets of information and, into a compelling drama. And there's like a certain structure in the narrative that I think has a lot to do with like the consonance, dissonance, consonance, or the resolution. There's like a 3-part kind of structure that
Yes.
really hits people hard. It's like almost therapeutic in a way, where you have like the climax and the resolution. You see that in music, you see that in story, and it allows us to kind of go on like a journey vicariously through other people's experiences. Even though these people aren't real, we still feel that. And that's really important because it kind of taps into the mythical elements that are still within us, regardless of what we think, or we might think that we're above all that. It's still a part of us. And if we dismiss it, then I think we're going to have a lot of problems, psychological problems, I think, because we're kind of like trying to erase a part of us that is, essential to who we are.
The metaphor I've heard is that rationality is the blossoming of the flower, and that our magical and irrational aspects are like the stem and the root, and to just want the flower and to try to uproot yourself to just be a flower, it's a recipe for not blossoming.
Yeah.
That's the perfect analogy. Definitely. Yeah.
Like I like a lot of rationalist authors, but one of the favorite things I've heard was that we're not rational beings, we're irrational beings capable when convenient of rationality, and that it's a limited skill and resource, but that it's just a superficial aspect that's very useful and has made us supposedly the dominant species or whatever, but it's not the majority of us or most of our essence. It's just it's a nice little rudder that has a big influence on things, but it's a little part of the bigger.
The metaphor I like for what you're saying is the man with the hammer, which Maslow, among others, cited that example. It goes back further than him, but the idea that to the man with the hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And the corollary is whether it is or not. It's like there is something in us that wants to reframe the world in terms of the tool that we're using right now.
Well, I think the big trick is a lot of people confuse the tool with being the tool user, the master of the tool. A lot of people come up with great ideas, rational ideas are useful, not necessarily rational, but then forget that they created them and that it's a tool for dealing with the world, and then become a victim of their own, self-created pantheon of, meaning. So, but a lot of times it's hard for people to accept responsibility or remember that this is something I made. This is a tool, and I don't necessarily have to be a victim of just this one tool. I have other resources. So
Yeah, that's right.
That seems to be like a higher level of thinking in a way where you can observe the things that you have used reason in order to understand and grasp, like the models, but you can use the models and kind of operate on them like a surgeon from above.
Yeah.
And that's like a higher order of reason that maybe society has yet to fully evolve into. Some people have that ability. Most people probably don't. They get stuck in the reason, but not the understanding that you can use it as a tool. It is just a tool. Don't identify with it too much. Otherwise, it'll suck you into like an ideological straitjacket.
yeah, and there's a hard balance too, because a lot of tools we necessarily, in order to get the most out of them, have to kind of submit to them in a certain sense and let the tool or that module of mine or whatever knows better how to do what it wants to on its own without us, thinking about riding a bicycle, or the centipede
Yeah.
when asked which legs do you start walking with first, all of a sudden couldn't walk anymore. Hey, Daniel. And yeah, so there is, in fact, it's funny because the same paragraph that talked about the blossom pulling up its roots metaphor even discussed how it's hard to withdraw ourselves from being consumed by the very means we use to control the world, and we wind up, the student becomes the master, but in this sense we're just talking about our ideas, the mortar that hardens, that we don't realize we're the ones that made the mold, not completely on our own. But
I just want to interject something I learned on Nova yesterday. They were talking about how slime molds actually can think without a brain. They actually just use the protein architecture to have all the characteristics of intelligence. They have repeatability, they have tropism, they have habituation. And they said, if you really want to visualize a plant, think of a person with their head buried in the ground, because that's really where the brain is. It's down in the ground, and the thing sticking up, the flower, that's like the genitals. That's the reproductive system. So, when you talked about pulling off the flower, that's not the brain. Yeah, the brain is stuck in the ground.
Yeah.
With all the soil intelligence and the microbes and goodies.
It's interesting. I've heard that, our stomach is like the roots, and Alan said we're walking around carrying our fertilizer with us, but it's a good metaphor. It's always fun thinking of people as some kind of vegetation.
Yeah.
But
they call us plants with complicated feelings is what an animal is. It's like, we still need sun, we still need water, we still need nutrients.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope it's not too much of a digression, but a lot of people I think are kind of nervous system chauvinists, like, I don't know, of the like vegetarian bent, and say, oh, well, even if you're killing a life form that's a planet doesn't have feelings like us. And we actually do share a handful of hormones that are related to pain responses, and just because they don't have neurons that we have, if under I forget the word, time lapse video of a plant in slow motion, they really do look like they respond very human like to certain stressors. You pinch a leaf and within a few hours it shrivels up, like, oh, don't do that.
Yeah.
So,
I think we're even probably going to discover that quarks might be conscious. If we really want to, take away our anthropocentrism.
Consciousness all the way down.
Yeah, it's probably conscious all the way down. Welcome to pantheism.
Well, I love that you bring that up, because I remember in our talk the other night, where I lost the thread was in talking about consciousness and like the Buddhist, my criticism of it. I won't go into that tangent right now, but just to kind of wrap it up without filling in the details, is that I do think there's a difference between life and consciousness. We're not conscious constantly, and we're alive many times. We're unconscious, sleep or forgetfulness, or the background workings of our mind, even while we are conscious. Is the majority of us is arguably unconscious. So I think there is, and it's one of my interests, study interests, to pursue the thought that perhaps all matter, inanimate or whatever, is alive, just not necessarily conscious, and of a different quality and a completely different type of life than we can imagine. But technically we're made up of it, on a very basic level. It's the building blocks we're made of. So it's always interesting to look at different levels of organization and postulate.
Yeah, and I just went to a transhumanist virtual enlightenment salon on brain preservation, and they were saying that if we could just capture the brain at the nano scale, you'd have a non-zero chance of being revived in the distant future, even without cryogenic preservation. But your brain essentially does this every morning. It reboots. When you're sleeping or under anesthesia, your brain is pretty much shut off, but it somehow retains enough structure to reboot every morning, and become you again.
I remember reading about like the majority of serotonin that our brain uses to think is produced by the gut. And so if you cut the cord there and just you have like this brain or neurology floating off in this, this other domain of like information, then what about all the hormones and the neurotransmitters and everything that are kind of like connected to the body? And a lot of it is produced down in the body, in the gut. So
yeah, I think you've got like a million neurons in your gut. In fact, the SEAL team even says if someone has a bad gut feeling about a mission, they'll abort just based on that.
Yeah, they call it like the second brain.
Yeah.
Although it's probably the first brain because it came before.
More brain chauvinism going on.
I went off too far on a rant. First off, let me say I'm out of practice socializing. So I've had a couple doses of it over the past few days, so I'm getting better at it. I'm easing back into it. So I'm sorry if I'm working on it. It's a work in progress. But
I don't mean to interrupt myself either. I'm probably been too interrupting.
We could bring it full circle because what you're saying ties right into what we were talking about. The tendency of a modern to think that the brain is more important than the body, to think that people are more important than the rest of nature, to think that our rules and laws are more important than our feelings, and all of this stuff is an extension of the medieval revolution kind of done again into the modern revolution. Because in the medieval era, they said, well, there's not many gods, there's only one God. And there's not many sources of meaning, there's only one source of meaning. And nature, you could just ignore now, you just focus on this one thing. And to go, what the moderns did by saying, well, only our ideas matter and our decisions matter, is really just the next logical step of saying you don't even need the God. The God's just a scaffolding. Just put all that away, and there's really just this one source of meaning, which is whatever we decide it is, which unfortunately just translates into nothing. But it's part of why it's rewarded to be an intellectual in the modern era. The more you can deal with complicated systems and rules and understand them and figure out how to manipulate them to get what you want, which ironically means you're being want-driven, but it's mediated through intellect and systems, the more you survive and excel in the modern era. And it encourages a sort of half-brained approach to the world in which we get disconnected from our feelings, disconnected from our bodies, disconnected from nature, disconnected from each other. It leads to monadism. We're focused in hyper-individualism and even individualized from ourselves. It's like, oh no, if only we could just be a floating brain. If only we could just be abstract ideas. If only we could transcend into the network. You hear all this stuff, and all of it is just modernism turning up higher and higher and higher into more and more abstract.
Piggybacking over the myths of Christianity, really, the transcendental ego.
Yeah, it's really just continuing that direction.
You had sort of a Freudian slip. You said the modern aura, and people that read auras will tell you that most people's auras are full of yellow, and yellow is the color of intellectualism and deconstructive linear thinking. That most people make yellow in their auras most of the time, according to at least one aura person I heard interviewed.
I've had type 2 bipolar all my life, which isn't the exciting one they make movies about. It's where you cycle in and out of depression. And when you're not depressed, to people who don't know you, you seem manic because you're not depressed. It's like he seems up, but actually, when you look at the up, it's like I'm not writing checks for $100,000 to myself. I'm just not actually depressed right now, and it seems like a spike by comparison. So the thing about that, you look at the modalities of treatment for bipolar, and they're awful. We have more treatment for depression than we do for bipolar. Bipolar is a real stumper. And in fact, if somebody has bipolar and substance abuse, most therapists won't treat them. They're like, I'm sorry, that problem is too hard. I just won't take on a case like that. It's called they call it double jeopardy. I have people like that in my family. And so what we're talking about is an extraordinarily difficult problem. And yet, I find I have a type 1 bipolar brother, and he and I can solve the problem for a week at a time by going in the backyard and doing intense workouts, doing martial arts. Not by thinking about the problem, not by being exhilarated, not by giving into the depression or the mania, but by grounding yourself in the body and working really, really hard. You squeeze out all the excess brain activity physically through sweat and through endurance and through, eventually you get this flood of hormones into your body that tells you to relax so you don't injure yourself. And literally for the next week, he's not manic. It's just like that. And there's no medication that can do that, but it's the body, right? It's reinforcing itself. So, you wonder how much of what we consider mental illness just comes from living in a society that encourages living extremely unbalanced lives that we didn't actually evolve for. The very things that, are pathological in the modern era might have been, extraordinary survival advantages when we had to more physically engage with the world, whether it's farming or hunting and gathering or what have you.
Yeah, playing with plants in the soil is incredibly therapeutic.
Right? That's a good example.
Yeah, I highly recommend the thing I'm not good at explaining that I tried the other night. I'll just recommend it. It's called polyvagal theory. It's by Stephen Porges, and if you look on YouTube, his son gives a nice little like half hour, 40-minute like good outline of the basics of it. But it has a lot to do with what we're talking about. Things like being in safe social spaces and also like physical activity that makes us breathe. Things that help us deactivate like our stress responses, which lead into a lot of mental quirks that are potentially unpleasant and unhealthy. And also it ties together the whole being in touch with your body, because a lot of the polyvagal theory, the vagus nerve is the one that goes to our guts. So if we're talking about like the second brain in our guts, I went off too far on too many tangents trying to describe it, so I'm not even gonna try. I'll just recommend. It's called the polyvagal theory.
Very good. I jotted it down in the chat.
And speaking of other nervous system theories, there's supposedly a whole photon microtubule system based on the mitochondria. It's like a second, photonic nervous system. And in fact, there's even some recent patents about, chemistry and viruses or vaccines that they can activate with different light parameters, which is kind of a 1984 spooky stuff patent. But that's another nervous system that is yet to be fully fleshed out, so to speak.
So think about intelligence for a moment. We think about it as something an individual does, right? You think you're smart. They're personal qualities, but the Greeks thought that your cunning or cleverness was an entirely lower order of intelligence from your wisdom. Your ability to do the right thing in the world, to act sustainably and with justice and with compassion was more important than your ability to, get one over on somebody else in a financial transaction or to clever your way out of a puzzle. They saw them as structurally different. And one of the ways in which that manifests is in the way that there are species that have behavior because they've got such a rich set of instincts that has been sustainable for tens or hundreds of millions of years in some cases. They are psychologically wise because their behavior is so guided by the frame that was built into them biologically through evolution. And that frame has already ruled out the many ways that they could do the wrong thing, because those people died off tens of millions of years of people. Those animals died off tens of millions of years ago or hundreds of millions of years ago. And what we're left with is a set of behaviors that's smart from a survivability perspective. It's sustainable. This is a species that could exist on the Earth, presumably for another 50 million years without destroying things or destabilizing itself or killing itself off, because those stupidities have been weeded out through evolution biologically. Now you compare that to the human condition, where in theory we're smarter, but we can also be dumber. And in practice, we're not currently showing much of a survival instinct. We're doing a lot of things that are almost optimized for destroying our own, sustainability and longevity. And you got to say, that's because we lack the biological intelligence or the biological psychology that's smart, that say a jellyfish has, or that a wolf has. And we're trying to make up for it with individual intelligence, with being clever enough to not make bad choices that a wolf would never make, you know, because a wolf evolutionarily knows better because he's got more instincts than we do. His instincts hem him in and stop him from doing the really stupid things that we can do.
I actually don't. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt if you were still going. I was just gonna say I've read in Steven Pinker, and he makes a great argument that it's not that we don't have as many instincts; it's that we have such a superabundance of them, that we have so many choices of innate behavior that we aren't necessarily lacking what a lot of animals have. It's that we have a surplus of it and kind of have to navigate the chaos of more options than just one reflexive instinct. Like the best book I can think of that tries to illustrate the point is Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate.
I'll have to read that.
Yeah, he tries to debunk a couple popular myths, in his opinion, blank slate being one, that we're not a tabula rasa, you know, that we come prepared with human instincts, like the ability to recognize faces, you know, when we're born, as the first things that we're pre-wired to recognize, and that we do actually have a set of instincts that, you know, he goes off in one of his other books, revolve around what Darwin called the instinct to acquire an art, which is like exemplified in the language acquisition and other things like that. I won't go too far off on it, but it's something else that it keeps snagging my mind if you talk about, because I do think that it ties into what you're talking about with like the mythological, and you know, many myths have it, the hole in our heart, or the absence of you know, the hunger, the epistemological hunger for more that doesn't seem to be present in most other animals that make us the sapient species, you know. So I don't know. It was just something out there, and I wasn't trying to ruin the flow of what you were saying. It's just
no, it's fine. And in light of that, I should qualify. I don't believe that we're tabula rasas. It's certainly, you know, studying biology or psychology today would confirm that we do have some instincts. We have maybe a dozen or 2 dozen of them, but there are a large number of instincts that you can see in other animals that just never develop in us, and they measure them. So I'll read The Blank Slate and see what he has to say about this and what he thinks
Blank Slate's
instinct
the name
is.
of the book, and that's one of his bigger myths that he's trying to debunk. He tries to debunk like associationist thinking, linguistic determinism. He goes off on a handful of things. One of them was just addressing the many people think we don't have the same instincts animals do, where it appears that we have a much more cerebrally focused set of instincts.
Yes.
That looks like, you know, because most animals start walking immediately, you know, within minutes of being born, you know, and he also ties it into other theories of the fact that we have such like larger encephalization ratio to body mass compared to other animals, that we're actually born prematurely. You know, like if you look at chimpanzees, their pregnancies up to, close to 18 months, which is almost twice as long. So we're like born, you know, halfway before we're fully cooked or whatever. And the idea that I think Susan Blackmore in The Meme Machine also has her mimetic account of the same phenomenon. But just that's why we have such women died during childbirth. The heads are so big and hips can't get wide enough evolutionarily at the same speed that our craniums are going. So there's like a evolutionary balance between those. But what is it? Yeah, oh God, sorry, I hope I didn't lose the thread. Fuck, I lost it. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, you've shaped in some things here, and they're important. You know, to say that we don't have, I think I'll read Pinker and I'll see what he says. But based on, you know, by temperament, I'm a biologist, psychologist. I'm crazy for this stuff. I read it a lot, and based on what I've read so far, his is certainly an outlier perspective, because most people think that we have fewer. I'm agreeing with him about the fact that we don't have none. That's not the case at all, and it's not just that we have subtracted away instincts. You're right. The ones that we have that are unique to us are very important to understanding human nature. So the mimetic impulse, the desire to imitate, the zeroing in on faces, pareidolia is important to that, because then it helps us to imitate people. as opposed to imitating a rock. It's like if you had mimesis without pareidolia, you'd be a bit of a problem in life. Or the you're born with the grasping. You could do this with newborns. Just tickle their palm and they'll close their hand. It's an instinct, and that's because that we get that from our primates. The hanging on to mom's fur. When you're born, even though they're not doing it anymore, we still have that. And it goes hand in hand with, if you put a baby on a glass table, they'll start crying because they have a fear of heights that they're born with. And that's because you're afraid of heights, so you hang on to mom's fur, and so you don't fall off as mom's swinging through the trees, and you're hanging on. This was a really basic survival instinct for human beings. And even though we don't live that way anymore, that one has survived to the present. Whereas the mimetic that you're talking about and the pareidolia are important for us now, because that's what helps us to acculturate. It helps us to focus on people's faces, to see what they're doing, to imitate what they're doing.
Yeah.
And we have that drive to do that.
I remember the last bit of the tangent. And
Yeah, please.
It was just that. So the theory, according to the stuff I said, was that if we basically were incubating in our womb for twice as long, we would come out basically capable of speaking and walking, because it takes about that long too.
Yeah.
So that when because of our, according to this theory, premature birth for reasons, that it just takes a year for the instincts that other animals similar to us would come out of the womb ready to start having their reflexes link up with their environment, where it takes about a year for, our more recently developed layers of our brain to have things to latch onto in a meaningful sense. So yeah,
I put that word in the chat. It's called neoteny. And I first read about it in Desmond Morris's Naked Ape.
Oh, I want to read that soon.
Yeah, it's good. He also wrote books about the psychology of cats you might enjoy. He doesn't get everything right, but you can tell he's an evolutionary biologist and a thinker. And I think neoteny's right on the money. It's like you say, other people are talking about it now. It seems to have borne out that we're basically premature births. And it's not just that we're premature births, but that the rest of the development cycle has been cut off from us. So some instincts kick in later, like in a year or 6 years or in the teen years, but other things never kick in at all, like the fact that we never become covered in hair head to foot. So we're retaining some of our infantile qualities right into adulthood.
Well,
and others just develop late.
One angle I've heard of the neoteny, I've never actually used the word in a conversation, I don't think, but I've read it a few times. One interesting angle of it, here, 1 second, was that, it applies to a theory of why we might be smarter monkeys than other monkeys, but also it's given a rationale for why when, say, we breed animals deliberately to be smarter for our own purposes, that they tend to take on traits of neoteny. Like when I think it was Conrad Lorenz bred the most friendly wolves when he put his hand in the cage, the ones that didn't have a fight or flight or shutdown response and actually express some curiosity towards his hands, he would breed them, and the pups would come out looking like pups longer.
Yes.
Shorter snouts,
yes.
Fur, barking longer than just for their mother's milk, and
that's right.
Yeah. No, it's got something, the theory went along that basically brains are mostly plastic during the infantile state, so that for a species like us to be smarter and smarter, basically we've been stretching out our infantile stage longer and longer so we can have more and more plasticity throughout life, and that arguably, the more childlike you are, the older you get, the smarter you are, because the second your brain starts, I don't know, not calcifying, but hardening the mold per se, the younger you are, arguably the less intelligence, by however you measure it, throughout life. So
we're born with all this creative potential that we lose a certain amount of as we get into our 30s. By about the time we finish, our brain finishes sort of settling into place. Another thing that you might find interesting to read about is the evolution of cats, the domestic cat, because we didn't domesticate them. That's pretty universally agreed that they domesticated themselves in order to survive around us, because we had agriculture and we had grain, and that attracted the kinds of things cats like to eat. And so they had to figure out how they could get along with us in order to make us, not punish them. And so they've been able to work out that domestic cats as such didn't exist before the Ice Age, and they've really domesticated themselves in a shockingly short amount of time.
Yeah.
But that much of what happened is neoteny, that through their own self-selected evolution, they retained kitten qualities into adulthood, like being more social, being more curious and playful, liking to be pet more, purring more, meowing more. It's like you're saying, all those juvenile qualities they retain into adulthood. But in their case, it wasn't done to them. They did it to themselves.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people like to have the accusatory, oh, we went out and subjugated species and we're just mutating them to our own diabolical purposes or whatever. But this is a very good argument that, nah, it was convenient for them to mutate themselves to us because we were, you know, an easier bread meal ticket or whatever. But no,
Yeah.
I've heard the same theory for like dogs, wolves, you know, the ones that had the gumption to get closer to the encampment.
Yeah. They got advantages.
Because they were closer. And really, with Conrad Lorenz, literally the first generation automatically looked so much more pup-like and different and smarter. So
it doesn't take long, right? Because there's a huge amount of variation within a species.
Yeah,
and so
like I don't believe in Lamarckianism, you know, in the, well, not all of Lamarckianism. I don't believe in the inherited acquired the inheritance of acquired
features.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
Attributes. There you go.
Yeah.
You know, I believe in the Weissmanian barrier.
Yeah.
But I do also think, though, it only takes 1, 2, 3 generations. You know what I mean? To
It's
make
surprisingly fast.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's because species have so much diversity within them. I mean, we can draw a circle around it and call it a species, but nature abhors a vacuum and nature abhors a monoculture. So any species naturally radiates variations, which, you know, if it's got enough of them, then it's able to respond rapidly to change.
Yeah. So I love all this stuff we're talking about. I had a question, and I'm curious your opinion on it. I don't know. I'm not trying to derail us or go necessarily force us back onto the topic, but it's something I wanted to ask. So you were talking about Achilles, and you were saying that you're talking about the virtuoso.
Yeah.
Saying that you know, it was sort of like a self, you know, taking on sacrifice to live up according to this, you know, godly ideal, you know.
Yeah, as part of the Paideia project, you want to exemplify a virtue.
Yeah, and so it's funny you were talking about it's nice to have these kind of like caricaturized mnemonic, you know, folktale, you know, even children can understand, where you don't throw in the doubts, you know, the hesitations. Well, he wasn't a perfect guy, and you know, like we can quibble about was he really a virtuoso in all senses of the word, you know, and so I was thinking how you were saying that, and also how you were saying that, you know, we in our modern, you know, objective, I don't consider us objective, but I know what you're talking about, popular use of the term, that we think we have like a monopoly on understanding, and that, you know, that it requires, if we're not going to succumb to certain forms of bigotry and xenophobia or cultural isolationism or whatever, to expand our mind, to collect at least more than just our one perspective.
That's right.
You know, to that trying to see what the Greek worldview, from the ancient Greek worldview's frame of mind would be like, would be a useful thing for us to engage in, to have some more perspective on what without perspective would seem to be a monopoly. So it made me think, isn't introducing a second or more perspectives an opportunity to say, if objectivity, for example, was a form of virtue, and one wanted to be a virtuoso in some like Ayn Randian, Howard Rourke, or whatever other antagonist she uses to exemplify objectivism, wouldn't, you know, without having an absolutist kind of, this is the one way of looking at things, wouldn't introducing more perspective make it easier to question our own way of thinking? So that if we were to want to be a virtuoso, we would have to kind of cover up the fact that we did have doubts that come from another perspective saying, there's another way of looking at it, and that might not necessarily the best you get what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying, and you're right. That was what the best of the Greek philosophers thought ought to be our mission. It's what most of the philosophical critics of modernism say should be our mission. Certainly, it's Kenneth Smith holds that up as essential. He says the great risk here is that the Greeks, and the Greeks knew it, is that the human mind acts like the bed of Procrustes, the villain from the myth of Theseus. Moderns tend to know the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, but fewer of us ever learned the myth of Theseus on the road to Athens. When Theseus came of age, when he was a little boy, he'd been raised by his mom in a little parochial village, and his dad had left for him his inheritance under a giant rock that he could only lift when he got big enough and strong enough to lift it. And once he got his inheritance, he would then have to get on the road, leave the little parochial village, and come to the great city of Athens, the city of wisdom, named after Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So how do you move from parochialism to wisdom is the subtext of the myth of Theseus on the road to Athens. And on the road to Athens, he encounters a number of villains along the way, antagonists. And each of them has their own little house or hut or building or village that they live in. And each of them has their own stereotypical qualities about how they go about life. And one of the villains is the villain Procrustes. And what makes Procrustes tick is that he has a guest bed. And one of the fundamental rules of Greek culture was the responsibility to be a good host. It was considered sacred.
Yeah, Xenos, the virtue of the hospitality of the stranger.
Yes, and Procrustes claimed to be doing that, but what he actually did is when people slept on his bed, he would seize them, and if they were too short, he'd stretch them on it like a rack until they fit it, and if they were too long, he'd cut parts off of them until they fit it. So what he was actually doing was not hospitable at all. It was violence and murder, kind of shaped up, dressed up as though it were hospitality.
Yeah.
And of course, that particular encounter ends with Theseus doing that to himself on his own bed. So that's the end of Procrustes. But the whole point of the story of Procrustes isn't just, well, that's a cute story, but that every human mind is a bed of Procrustes, and we are all Procrustes. When we look at the world, we warp everything to make it fit our preconceptions about how the world works and what meaning is. That the mind is a distorting device more than it is an organ of truth. And so our great challenge is to identify what warpages our own mind characteristically imposes upon the things that we experience.
Warpages?
Yeah, how do we warp what we're seeing? Because each of us is, the world's complex, our minds are complex, we're all a little different from each other. We're all going to warp the way. We may warp things overall according to the pattern of our epoch, how things are meaningful to us.
Okay.
But we're also going to warp them idiosyncratically according to who we are as an individual. And nobody can teach us what warpages we happen to have in our own head, right? So we have therefore, one of our life duties is to create opportunities to discover the warpages so that we can correct for them. We need to find ways to break out of our own perspective, look at how we naturally would have interpreted something, see how that's wrong, and then go back and change the way that we interpret the world to try to correct for that particular kind of distortion. And through that lifelong process of experimentation, adjustment, and then trying again, we can reduce the number of warpages, at least in the ones that we've located, so that we see things a little less bent. And so that mission to come up with new perspectives, there's two critical terms here. And one of them is cosmopolitanism, which was a term that Socrates came up with and that Diogenes in particular really embraced. And that's the idea that there is no parochial perspective that's right. There's no point in us arm wrestling for who's right, because we're all wrong. The world is right. And by nature, the human perspective is going to be distorted. And so we should just give up the battle for who's right and instead focus on our relationship to the world and trying out different perspectives and comparing their distortions to each other and use that to correct them. So that's what you were talking about a moment ago, is that the way out of the trap is to learn to see the world from different perspectives, to take on these different ideas. And that's one of the implications of cosmopolitanism, is that it only works if you can do that, if you can center yourself in different worldviews. Now, the risk is that we won't actually do that. That what we'll do is we'll read the Iliad, but we'll read it as a modern would read it. and then therefore we've misread the whole thing and say, well, now I understand the Greek perspective, when what you actually understand is a modern cartoon of the Greek perspective. And so to really break out of this requires immersing yourself deeply enough in that perspective to be able to make it alien in the way that it actually was alien from our perspective. To look for, instead of glossing over the confusion, the little momentary confusions and hiccups that warn us that we might not really understand why someone would say that, we should embrace those moments and go, this is weird. Why is it weird? What's strange about this? So that we can help to understand what's strange about the Greek perspective, so that we can role play that strangeness and then set that against ourselves and use it as a lever to kind of lever ourselves out of our complacency and go, oh, I guess you could think about free will that way. I guess you could think about nature that way. I guess divinities could be like that. That's a different angle.
Yeah. Well, it's great. So I guess the possible conflict I was wondering how you thought about was just if we were only looking at it from the one perspective of the story of Achilles, the kind of virtues he was trying to live up to be the full embodiment of, aren't necessarily, if you're trying to be, say, worship Athena and to become
right.
cosmopolitan, wise, sage, does require, if you're going to be a virtuoso in that sense, this collecting of different centers, I think was the word you just used.
Yeah, you need a pantheon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
you need multiple perspectives.
Well, it's funny because it made me think when you said centers, I was thinking of like how I said earlier, the specific molds that we make for ourselves and forget that we're the one that set the mortar. So it's
right.
It's really interesting what you were saying, because I remember before I chimed in on the talk, overhearing you talk about hubris and nemesis, which I really like. I was thinking of when you were talking about Theseus. I knew Procrustes. I didn't remember the whole story of Theseus, which gives it more context, which is exactly what we're talking about trying to do if we're trying to fit into the Greek frame of mind. But just that Nemesis was, he got a taste of his own medicine.
Right.
And it's just one thing I'm thinking of it. I've been thinking a lot about hubris lately. I've been trying to pin it down as something specific, that's not necessarily pride or narcissism, grandiosity, but more
it's bigger than that. It goes beyond that.
Yeah, like I think like humility in some sense does qualify as like an absence of hubris or the internal counter to it. But I'm not trying to limit it to just this, humility, hubris, or like pride and shame, because I think there's non-hubristic possibilities for pride. Like I'm proud of you for, and I'm proud of myself for, and it be not some, offense to the gods or what.
That's right.
Or super
That's right.
Or morality or whatever. But so
well, think about what you're saying from the Greek ethos, from their perspective of nature, then the divinities, then man. So you could be proud of yourself without thinking that it's not possible to be better. And you could be proud of yourself without thinking that nobody in the history of the universe has ever been better or ever will be better. You can be proud of yourself in terms of, relative to your previous accomplishments or relative to the other people who've been working on this with you and go, wow, I was the one who actually figured this out. That's cool. And that's just like normal, healthy pride.
Well, I think a lot of people confuse pride, hubris, humility or shame in a way that limits themselves. They don't give themselves the encouragement, the pride
right.
to engage in the
encouragement's so important.
They don't give themselves the credit that's due to them. And
that's
I think
right.
Not being able to do that for yourself carries over, and not being able to do it for others, and you're missing out on a wide arena of reciprocity if you can't, not just with others in like the nemesis hubris sense of the word, because I think that's exactly what nemesis was. It was the consequence of the hubris of not having a proper reciprocity with others.
Yes.
Besides,
What you're talking about, that difficulty with the word pride, is a consequence of the medieval era. Because in the medieval era, since they overthrew nature, right, and lowered it, the idea that there was anything worth being proud of in human nature was considered a sin. And that what we should do is abjectly throw ourselves to the earth and say that we are wretched, wretched sinners who deserve to burn in hell. Thank God for his grace that he lifts us up even though we don't deserve it.
Yeah,
that became the ultimate refutation of the ancient order that said, no, you're supposed to lift yourself up and you're supposed to strive to do better. And the medieval response was, no, you're not. You're not. You can't. You're worthless worms. God is what's important, and you should just be humble all the time. And so we struggle now with the words pride and humility because the moderns inherited that medieval gloss upon them. And now we struggle about the difference between hubris and pride, between abject humility and a proper humility, a healthy humility.
Yeah, well, I like it. You're even using the same kind of up down. It's kind of I know I'm sure we see things in our own different warpage or whatnot, but I like that because it's what we're talking about. There's a lot of people, they're either in a sense bipolar in one extreme of, you know, oh, I'm king shit of, you know, of Pooh Bah Mountain or whatever, and you know, and if I'm not that, I'm just the lowest piece of shit on earth. And
right, it's polarization.
Like I think in that sense, like the word shame, in like the pride shame dichotomy, you know, in a humiliation, not just humility, but like in a lower sense, you know, shameful sense of the word. I like that we're both kind of agreeing on this humility as a more balanced. Don't be so hubristic. You're not the top of the great chain of being, but don't just shit on yourself like you're not the bottom. You're not the weakest link in the chain. You know, you're not the bottom of the totem.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, an absolutism was introduced by the medieval worldview. It's everything got concentrated into one, and the one had all value and all goodness and all power and all worth, and everything else was completely stripped of all nature, all value, all goodness, all worth. There became this sense that God can do anything, but we can do nothing. We're helpless. And our only job is to adore and worship and throw ourselves on the ground. It's a particularly extreme form of the religion that was held up as the ideal in the medieval world. And the problem is that it was self-sabotaging because, you know, how are we supposed to learn to behave better if there's no point in striving, and if we can't encourage ourselves when we do well and criticize ourselves when we do badly? If we just try to floor everybody and flatten everything to say everybody's worthless except that God lifts us up, then we destroy the ability to struggle to do better. And the ability to struggle to do better is like at the heart of the ancient ethos. That was what their core thing was.
Well, you know, I would argue that it's a biological need. You know,
it is.
Like, well, for example, like I think the thing I keep thinking of when we're talking about this, like just going to the one extreme, is that in a lot of senses it's easier to go full tilt than to try to maintain a balance. You know, it's simple. Yeah. It's God's will. Resign yourself to it. You know, it's just let it happen. You know, like you have no
right.
Which is funny because it ties into a lot of the ideas I've been thinking about hubris. Like I think a lot of people make themselves unnecessarily suffer these days because they take on a kind of responsibility, a kind of like Atlas personality of the world, and you know, the weight of the world's on their shoulders, and it causes them so much suffering. And I think that they're doing it out of a sense of like duty, you know, possibly associated with this worldview we're speaking of, that like I should do something for the suffering, real or imagined, of others, and I'm not good enough, not serving to the umpteenth degree, you know. And I guess just
a realistic sense of who you are and your context, what you can and can't do, what you need to learn and what you don't need to learn, how other people around you relate to you in terms of, you know, what are they better at, what are they worse at, to be able to put yourself in context without absolutizing, without everything turning into, do I go to heaven or hell? Am I going to live forever in joy and happiness, or am I going to be tortured forever and destroyed because I deserve to die? It's like that polarizing thing destroys meaning. It's in the subtlety in between, in the balance, that meaning can be found and choices can be made. And that was something that the ancients had and the medievals got rid of.
Well, that's one of the things that I think, you know, articulating it with you, really making me think about the idea of balance. You know, if we go so far in the one extreme and say, you know, it's all God, the one thing you can do is surrender your hubris or pride or ways of sin and just be in a constant state of repentance or whatnot. But that, you know, there's an argument that our responsibility, that's a wrong, that the sense I just laid out is a wrong kind in some sense, because it does take on a certain hidden hubris that makes us think we actually do control a lot of things that we don't have control over, that we feel responsible for, and that making ourselves suffer is a kind of offense to the gods because they have a feast and a bounty, so to say, to offer us, that we're kind of abnegating.
Yeah.
Saying, oh no, it's all you. You know,
And,
it's
and,
all-
it, and it wastes our opportunities to do good in the world if we tell ourselves that the only good worth doing is everything, and if we can't do everything, then we should do nothing.
yeah.
Again, the polarizing destroys meaning. It always does. The meaning is always found in the middle. So one of the examples is the nature of the balance, and this is something that's talked about in this essay that David shared by Kenneth Smith. You know, he alludes to 3 character types. And we've sort of, this whole call sets this up, and now we've only got 8 minutes left, but that's okay. Let's do it. So he said the Greeks said there were basically 3 character types. There were douloi, there were banausoi, and there were aristoi. And what makes these character types tick is that the douloi are driven by their appetites and feelings, and it's the way that we're naturally born. If we don't do any further cultivation, then any infant has hungers, right, and fears and so forth. It's the lowest level that we can exist at, but it does have the advantage that at least if somebody does something wrong to us, we can get angry, and if we're hungry, we can feel hunger. There's a certain basal orientation towards reality that's built into the douloi that we all inherit, that we get when we start out. The banausoi react against the limitations of douloi by abstracting themselves and becoming more intellectualized. By saying, I'm going to master a system, I'm going to master a craft, I'm going to learn to be a master crafts, a carpenter or a master programmer or a lawyer. I'm gonna get some skill set. I'm gonna climb the ladder of expertise and become great at it. And I'm gonna judge the world not just in terms of my drives and reactions and instincts, but I'm going to judge it in terms of this intellectual schema that I've learned, that I've memorized. So, I may be part of a religion that tells me what's right and wrong, and I'm going to judge it by that instead of by how I feel. It might be part of a ideology that tells me who the good people are and who the bad people are, and I'll judge everything by that. It could be nihilistic and just pragmatic and say, well, I'm not going to worry about right and wrong. I'm just going to focus on how I get what I want. But whatever it is, it's an abstracted schema from reality. And so the thing about the abstracted schema is it gives you some distance from the being a slave to your passions, but it does so at the cost of making you a slave to your ideas, right? You become a slave to the system of ideas that you have accepted as a replacement for your passions and drives. And the great tragedy of modernism is that in a nutshell. What we've created is a world in which people who are very good at manipulating ideas and climbing through abstract schemas dominate people who can't do that and exploit them. They use their emotions against them. Advertising works on your feelings, right? Gets at your drives and your reactions. Why is the sexy woman lying on the caressing the car? There's like all this stuff, all this subtext of these commercials is designed to appeal to you at a doulic level and drive you back down to your limbic system and your responses. But at the same time, the banausoi are creating a world that's collapsing because it's divorced from consequences in terms of in real terms. Everything's reinterpreted Procrusteanly into what do the terms measure in terms of money, or in terms of my personal social power, or did I accomplish the goals that I set out for myself? They're all abstracted. And so they miss things like, yes, but did I just poison an aquifer so that now there will be no fresh water for the next 100,000 years in this piece of land?
Man.
It's like that,
Oh,
that sense of connection. So what we've got is a flat land in which there's only 2 character types that are really allowed to exist within modernism. The Greeks knew a third type that is almost exterminated in the modern order, and that's the aristoi. And what the aristoi did is not just balance feelings against ideas, but they went out into the world and studied nature and the gods and figured out what the virtues ought to be that would lift us up and help us to behave more coherently, more sustainably, to be able to make a going concern that could have justice, in which people's suffering could be alleviated, wrongs could be righted, and generally speaking, there was a chance that it could be a long-term society instead of a short-term society. And so these people are motivated by a third thing, separate from feelings and ideas, that is virtues. How does nature actually work, and how do we have to orient ourselves in nature in order to function in nature, in order to survive and not just be a passing phenomenon? And the Greeks thought those people should be in charge. Plato's Republic is sort of a warped version of it. He makes a totalitarian society in which the people he puts at top he claims are virtuous. But what the Greeks wanted is that whoever was the most virtuous ought to rise to the top, and that they could help to educate and acculturate the douloi and aristoi to help each of these sort of half-wit mentalities understand what they're missing. Why is appetite not enough? And why are schemes of ideas and ideologies not enough? Why does there also have to be orientation towards nature? So there's this triangle, if you will, of different sources of meaning that they constructed. And that when the medieval revolution overthrew the hierarchies of the ancient world, one of the things it overthrew is the very concept of aristoi. They were erased. And
Yeah, we kept the word aristocracy, but we lost the original intention behind it.
it turned into a bad thing. Oh, the stupid people who think they should be in charge.
It wasn't like a Nietzschean natural ranking of the wisest. It was more, hey, you're my friend. You're in charge of this monopoly, or
or we're in charge. Let's call ourselves great. The inversion of the ancient order is I claim to have all virtues because I'm the boss, and you can't argue with me. So there, it's like there were these warpages again.
Yeah, well, there may be enlightened absolutists out there, but also, God, I can't remember which king it was, but the last argument of kings is the gun. I think it was King Louis XIV.
Yes.
Had it on his cannons. No, and it's like one of my favorite quotes from Napoleon is, "You don't argue with intellectuals, you shoot them."
Yeah. That's a very modernist response, right? Yeah. Right there. Just.
And I mean, I don't know. I don't feel like it's incompatible with Louis XIV, really, because it's like Che Guevara's, you exhaust all legitimate means before you resort to violence, but don't handicap yourself by excluding that from being the last possibility. But
so, yeah, and the problem is that what the medieval world tried to do is erase the aristoi. And then for Banausoi, it said, well, God will be the source of all schemes and ideas and meaning. And the rest of you should just be douloi. We should all be slaves to God. And if God is all good and all knowing, he will tell us the right things to do. And if we do those things, we'll create a just world. You could sort of see the recipe and how it was supposed to work. And what it left out, unfortunately, is the possibility of a world in which God isn't being very clear to us about right and wrong, and other schemers are moving in and claiming to speak for God when actually they speak for their own appetites or for their own desire to excel. And so you get this corruption and hypocrisy that gets into the system. Yeah, that's where banal comes from, is from Banausoi. And so there was good reason for the modern world to overthrow the corruptions that the medieval world sort of turned into over time naturally because of our inability to get the direct voice of God telling us what's right and wrong and what we should do. It's like by telling us that people couldn't do it, that only God could do it, we put ourselves into a situation where, well, since God wasn't telling us clearly, other people moved in to tell us, and they were corrupt. They were not the best. We were no longer had a system in which the best rose to the top. We were denying there were any best. And so therefore the worst of us could climb on top and say, I'm speaking for God and God wants you to give me all your money, right? The televangelist is sort of the final endpoint of the medieval world order, the complete corruption of what should have been a pure source of meaning and truth. Yeah. So, and our problem is in the modern order, in overthrowing that, we've now got nothing. It's like we just fight for, who can use the system to beat whom. It's turned into nihilism, which was Nietzsche's great criticism of the modern world order.
Yeah. Well, I think we just said kind of parallels like similar to, I think it's Mircea Eliade when he talks about the sacred and the profane, saying there's no sacred space anymore. It's all profane. But
yes.
Well, I think that, God, the movie Stigmata.
Yes.
Was very much like, oh no, don't let people think they have an active say in what goes on. The whole moral was the one Dead Sea Scroll that talked about the kingdom of heaven is within you and without you. It's everywhere you look. And I think this is it was interesting. It ties me back to what a thought that I had when we were discussing hubris and nemesis. I like having a very cybernetic oriented model of our reality where, basically everything we're experiencing is a kind of negative feedback, and that we have a model of reality that is never going to be omniscient, which means it's always to a degree inaccurate and imprecise, and arguably makes us in error or in sin or in hubris to some degree. And I like the way we're discussing, makes me think, hubris in this context isn't something that we will ever overcome. The important thing is to have the reciprocity with the nemesis that comes from, say, either others or nature. And I think that if you tie that in with the kingdom of heaven is within you and within everyone else as well, because we're talking about like a great leader, whether he is actually wise or not, coming along and saying, I'm God, I'm the voice of God. And, you know, whether it's through convincing rhetoric or, you know, the barrel of a gun, a lot of like, I read A.M. Hocart, who talks a lot about in tribal societies, the chief or the shaman or the grand poobah, the alpha, you know, is almost universally seen as the closest to God and therefore the mouthpiece of the God or gods, you know. So I think there is a kind of, whether he is an enlightened absolutist or not, he's the closest. He since we're such social creatures and the social being primary to us, the alpha of our pack is in many ways the most godlike entity we have a direct interaction with, because, you know, the God of nature is a quiet God that we can't interact with directly. We have to add our own projections, our own Procrustean bed to try to interpret, you know, his silence through or whatever. So
Heraclitus, the philosopher Heraclitus, said nature loves to hide. The truths of the world, the meanings of the world are subtle. You have to study, because nature doesn't just hand you the answers. They're all disguised and encoded.
Yeah.
So I gotta wrap up and leave. You guys can certainly stick around, but I think, you know, certainly what's being suggested here, the upshot is our goal should be to move past modernism and to figure out, how do we reorient our sources of meaning in a healthier, more sustainable way than modernism, or ideally than any of the three have done it before. Because, you know, the ancient world had its flaws too. You know, it had its cruelties and stupidities. So if there's some new way to put together the relationship between man, God, and nature, and maybe other things that were left out of this picture, maybe there's a fourth or a fifth thing that ought to be here, you know, to try to come up with a society that really does respect our need to survive by paying attention to nature, and that respects our need to project out ideals or virtues that we can be pursuing to try to behave more like, to try to rise ourselves up from our worst impulses to our better impulses. You know, if we sort of try to reconstruct that framework but do it in a new way, then we might give ourselves a way as moderns to evolve into something new that could do better than we're doing now. It's kind of the direction that this all sort of hints at. It sort of points like an arrow pointing. But at any rate, thank you all. I had a great time today, and, you know, I'll be back next Monday.
All right.
yeah, it was great
Thanks
talking
for
with
being
you.
here, Rick. And I think I'm gonna drop the whole call till next week, everyone. Thanks for being
Thanks
here.
again,
and
Rick.
Check
That was
the
really
calendar.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was fun. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to
Check the
participate.
calendar. We got more
Great.
stuff coming. So till
Talk
next
to you
week,
next time.
everyone. Okay. Bye.
Take care, all.
Live long and prosper.
Yeah.